Welcome into Normalized PTSD, and today kind of got inspired by the book Struggle Well, as well as talking to Ken Falk, so I just kind of went down that rabbit hole a little bit and was able to get in contact with Dr. Tedeschi. He's going to join us today, and he's going to talk about PTG, where the idea came from, and dive into that a little bit more. Hope you guys enjoy. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. I've been watching your videos and trying to get more information on PTG. Kind of what sparked this interest in mine is I just read the book Struggle Well and spoke with Ken, and we kind of went down what that organization does and things of that nature, and just going to start top down and just work our way up with who is Richard Tedeschi, and then after that get into PTG and how you and I believe it's Dr. Calhoun discovered that.
Myself and Lawrence Calhoun, my colleague at University of North Carolina, Charlotte, had been thinking a good deal about how people respond to stress and crises, and we were talking about how no one had really looked very closely at how people do well. People have focused a lot on PTSD and disorder and treatment of that, and that's all well and good, but we thought we had a lot to learn from people who had somehow managed through these traumatic events and come out doing well. So we thought we'd start to find those people and interview them and learn from them about their experiences. And so we started by talking to people who were older people who had been widowed late in life and done well with that, managing that difficulty in their lives. We talked to people who had suffered physical disabilities in adulthood, who had been paralyzed or blinded, had significant physical disabilities, but had managed them well and come through that as people who were not only intact, but changed in some ways. So we contacted people in our area who were like that, going through our networks and whatnot, did interviews, and they started telling us the story of what we later described as post-traumatic growth. We coined that term to describe what people were telling us about the impact of these experiences on them, which changed the kind of people they were.
So the way that I kind of see this here is PTSD can be described as the negative impacts of a traumatic situation, whereas PTG is almost the positive impact of that traumatic situation. Is that a fair, I guess, summarization?
That's fair. That's fair. But I think it's important to recognize these things are mutually exclusive. People can have symptoms of PTSD or be diagnosed with PTSD and still show post-traumatic growth too. So the same situations that create the symptoms and the disorders and whatnot, the same miserable and traumatic situations in life also are catalysts for later growth. So these things sometimes co-occur, but when you experience the growth aspect of this, the symptoms tend to be reduced. That's what we have found out through our studies. Or at the very least, people report that they're able to tolerate the symptoms better, because it's not like the symptoms of PTSD are just useless and in vain. Instead,
Right.
They can be tolerated because there's more to life than just those symptoms. There's more that's meaningful and purposeful.
You speak on 5 categories of PTG. What are those?
Well, when we did our interviews originally, we took what people were saying and created some statements out of these things, described the kind of change and growth that they were describing to us. Then we used those statements to start to put together a measure of post-traumatic growth that we could ask people these questions. And so when we did that, and we did a lot of statistical analyses of the responses we got, these statements and these questions devolved into 5 categories. So one category is where people say that their relationships with other people have improved in some way, that they've become closer, or they've become more compassionate or empathic, um, that their emotional connection with people is stronger. So that's generally one category. Another category people describe is personal strength. They see they're stronger than they thought they were, or going through what they went through has made them stronger people in the end, even though it's been challenging. A third category is the circumstances might have opened up new opportunities for them that they haven't seen before. Sometimes this results because people are not able to pursue the kinds of things they did before. Sometimes it's because people see the kind of things they're doing before as not very important anymore, and they want to do something that has more relevance or importance to them. But for one reason or another, people sometimes describe themselves as developing priorities or interests or opportunities that they wouldn't have before. Fourth category is a greater appreciation of life. It's when people have more gratitude for their lives, or see more value in life, and maybe appreciate things that they might have overlooked before or taken for granted. And then a fifth category is some kind of spiritual or existential change, where people start asking questions about what the purpose of their life is. It's kind of the cliche of the meaning of life. What's the meaning of life? But
Right.
it's important to people. I mean, people have to feel that they're doing something in this world that's important. And so when people start to figure out what their contribution is, or what their mission might be, and how they're going to do something in life that might be of benefit, just beyond themselves, but also for people around them in some way. Though that's kind of spiritual and existential exploration, which leads people to think more deeply about how they're living, is another area of growth that we've found in people. So those are the 5 areas that we've had people talk to us about.
To go and see people that are still struggling at a high level, it's really it's sad to see, for one. But during that journey I've explored, holistic approaches, therapeutic approaches, and just trying to get a better understanding of, like things that can impact PTSD in a positive way. And that's why I started this podcast, because I want to continue finding other things that benefit. Like, I feel like where I'm at in life now may not be the limit. Maybe there's a better quality of life, a higher quality of life. And why I pursue that journey, I want to like share that with my other combat veterans that may still be suffering in silence.
Right. So that's exactly what we're talking about here, because, with post-traumatic growth, one of the things um, that seems to be kind of a crucial step in it, or element in it, that really kind of nails it down for people, is when they come up with some kind of mission, where they decide there's something that they need to do that's a benefit to other people. And so all the difficulties they've been through starts to carry some kind of meaning, because it's driven them in a direction that they wouldn't have explored otherwise, and that they're making an impact somehow on people, the world, somebody, somehow, um, and that impact is very, very satisfying. So maybe in your story of how you developed this podcast, and how you try to figure out some way to reach out to people or have an impact this way, represents part of the mission that you're developing, and it's it's something that's ongoing. I mean, it's strange what happens in life, and what who you run into, what opportunities open up, and what happens. So it's hard to predict sometimes where it's all going to go.
It really is. It's all about perspective and enjoying the ride and just leaning into it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And there's a, there's, when you talk about perspective, that's a big part of this post-traumatic growth concept is perspective change, because what really sets it off is when people's belief systems that are foundational and core are challenged, so that you have to start changing your perspective to figure out, what the heck happened to me here, and who am I now, and what am I going to do? That's a perspective shift, and that's what gets people on the pathway towards changes that become very important to them.
Positive changes. During your research, what percentage of people did you encounter that experience PTG?
This is a tricky question. Trick question. Okay.
Yeah.
So the reason I say it's tricky is because there are a lot of different kinds of people and a lot of different kinds of circumstances. So, it's hard to generalize sometimes.
Right.
But we developed an instrument where we asked people about positive and negative changes that happen. And people can report these positive changes that I'm talking about, or changes in these ways in life that are negative, like their relationships become worse, or they feel weaker than they were before, or whatever. So we constructed this kind of questionnaire and asked people about whether their changes were in the positive direction or the negative direction, or both, sometimes both. And we found out that it generally seems about 3 times more likely people will report the positive changes than the negative ones. So people report both of them, but 3 times more of the positive changes than the negative ones in general.
Mm.
So that kind of gives you some idea how post-traumatic growth is not unusual, and it's a common experience. It's a natural experience, and so in your podcast, it's about normalized PTSD, right? Because I think you've learned, and maybe you're talking about the fact that PTSD is a natural experience that human beings have when they're subjected to very stressful or traumatic circumstances. We have, this is the normal response of the body and the mind to something that's extraordinary. And post-traumatic growth is a natural experience too, where we reach forward into something that's going to allow us to live life in a meaningful way, despite all that's been troubling us. So both these experiences are human experiences. And I think it's important to see the whole picture,
Right.
both the positive and the difficult parts of experience in response to trauma.
Do you find that maybe the negative aspects, I would imagine that'd be more like the PTSD aspect, is underreported because of the stigma? It may be weak, or people not willing to. It's easy to accept something positive in your life more than it is something negative.
Well, certainly there is some degree of stigma associated with reporting anything that's called a disorder. So people don't like to think of themselves as disordered generally, do they?
No, they don't. And I find there's a lot of veterans and police officers in my community that really wish that the disorder part would get removed.
Right. So that we could talk about post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, because then it's more common. It's more palatable,
Yeah, that's right. And of course, another part of reporting this is for people who are active duty or in these responsible positions. They're concerned that this is going to have an impact on their careers. So that's the other thing too. It's very, very rational and practical that people don't want to talk about these things if they think that it's going to cause them problems. And of course, sometimes that's exactly what happens.
Yeah, that's what happened with me, as well as a few I know of. PTG, it could be an example of living well. Do you think someone with post-traumatic growth is better suited to deal with future struggles and challenges in life.
Yes, it's a pathway to becoming more resilient, because you develop a way of understanding life and understanding yourself, and how to respond to things, that allows you to be better able to see the truth in it all, accept the truth of what's happening, accept that it's what's happening to you is human, and that it's not crazy, but that what's happening to you is understandable, predictable, and just a expression of your humanity. So so that's part of what people come to appreciate when they recognize their own personal strength. That personal strength has to do with flexibility and acceptance and being able to see your own vulnerability. It's not a very rigid thing, because things that are rigid just snap. If you're flexible, you can bend with the forces that are against you without breaking.
Mm-hmm.
So that personal strength has to do with that ability to bend a bit when things get hard, and it's also the ability to be connected with others, having better relationships, and seek support when you need it, and that not being a sign of any kind of weakness in your own mind. And it allows you to, post-traumatic growth allows you to see that even though things are difficult, they can still be meaningful. So you're not just suffering in vain, you're suffering sometimes for something that's meaningful.
Right.
So all these things, allow people to handle difficulties in life from a perspective that allows them to manage it well, and maybe learn even more about what life means and how to live it.
During your research, did you notice any characteristics in people with PTG opposed to those who did not? Were there some indicators of this personality is more likely to have PTG than, say, another personality type?
Well, there are some minor indications of that. I don't like to make too much of that, because it can start to sound like if you don't have a certain kind of personality, you're doomed.
Right. I have a follow-up to that, and it's basically, can you teach someone PTG? Can you teach them how to experience life in a healthier way, in a better way? Is there things that we can do to encourage them to maybe look at it differently?
Well, yes. For example, myself and a colleague of mine at Boulder Crest, Brett Moore, wrote a post-traumatic growth workbook where we try to lead people through a number of exercises and steps and reflections that allow them to move towards post-traumatic growth. So yes, we've written the post-traumatic growth workbook for that purpose. Now, what do people have to learn? Well, some of the personality characteristics you're talking about can be to some degree learned. A couple that are important, for example, is to connect with other people, to approach other people. That's easier for some folks than for others, depending on their personality. But you can learn to do that. So you have to be able to connect. Another thing is you have to be open to novel experiences rather than denying them or running away from them, avoiding things. So you have to have this approach orientation to life, where you're willing to look at things and try things and approach rather than avoid. But as you might know, so much of the PTSD symptomatology has to do with avoidance. anxiety and avoidance.
Or emotional avoidance by substance abuse, trying to numb those feelings.
Yes, exactly. That's another form of avoidance. Absolutely right. So, moving past that to approaching the things that are happening to you or have happened in the past that are disturbing is part of this process too. And when you can find people you can connect with and start to talk about those things with, it works out a whole lot better. That's part of the process, being able to disclose about your own self and what you're going through and your vulnerability, to open that up. And a lot of people don't like to hear it, especially men, especially guys in the military and whatnot. They don't like to talk about vulnerability.
No.
But I'll tell you one thing. This is something that I'll often say to people who are veterans and service members about vulnerability. If you're a field commander, you better know about vulnerability, because you have to know, if you're going to plan a strategy in a battle, how your troops are. Are they well equipped? Are they well trained? Are they seasoned or not? You have to know their vulnerabilities. Is your equipment, got some vulnerability?
Yeah.
Are your troops got some vulnerability? Are you in a place where you have a vulnerable position? Are you up on a high place or down in a low place? I mean, you have to know about where you're vulnerable to plan a good strategy to win a battle. If you ignore your vulnerabilities, they're going to get taken advantage of. It's the same in life. If we ignore our vulnerabilities, we're going to suffer for that. And so we got to know ourselves in this way, and hopefully let other people who are trusted others know about these vulnerabilities as well, so they can help us out with them. You can't be good at everything in life.
No.
I learned after years of messing around that I'm not really a very good car mechanic. I finally came to the conclusion, I think I'm done with this. I'm going to give it up. And I found a really good mechanic. I said, hey, you do it. I screw it up half the time anyway. So that was my vulnerability. I admitted to it, and it's been good.
Yeah.
It's worked out. So anyway, I think that's something that we all have to approach in order to grow in a positive direction, and not insist that no matter what, we're going to go it alone. That's a formula for down the road some really ugly outcomes.
Absolutely. I've had some really good friends kind of support me, which I guess helped me ultimately evolve. One was, I used to avoid uncomfortable situations. And if you think about that, like, the more you avoid uncomfortable situations, the more situations become uncomfortable. So instead of doing that, I had a friend tell me, become comfortable with uncomfortable. So it was more just changing my perception on it. And I made it into a bit of a game, to where now I kind of giggle when it gets uncomfortable, because I find it entertaining in a sense. So that was definitely one minor thing that I did. Diving back into PTG, during your research of that, did you see any commonality, causation, correlation of PTSD and PTG? Like, is it, I wouldn't imagine.
Yes,
okay.
Yes. There's people who experience PTSD or symptoms of that kind are more likely to show post-traumatic growth, which sounds weird to start with, but actually it's a recognition that the same things that cause the symptoms of PTSD is a catalyst for growth. And the more difficult things are, the more growth that people generally see, because you can't change without challenge. So when the challenges are greater, even if they're miserable, you're more likely to be put in a position where you're going to have to do something different, where you're going to have to innovate.
Right.
So the worse the experience is, the more the growth. Now, some people will say, well, you know, if those two things are related, it doesn't seem like growth is also all that great a thing. You know, people who are showing growth are also all screwed up. But over time, that starts to shift. Over time, that initial difficulty starts to shift into lessened symptomatology, and the growth becomes associated with less distress. But it's a story that unfolds over time, and you know, sometimes it's a long time. So everybody's pathway is different with that. When you follow people down that path, eventually you get to the point where they're less distressed.
That kind of made me think about the book Struggle Well. And in there, I think it was mentioned a group of individuals that were probably mistreated as poorly as anyone could have been, which was the Vietnam POWs. And I believe it was you or Dr. Calhoun that identified or asked Ken, well, what's the percentage of people do you think had PTSD that came back from Vietnam as POWs? And it was something like 4%. And that's where the journey began with PTG. It was like identifying these people struggled at such a high level. You would assume that their PTSD would be really high, but it was the opposite. They were mentally strong after enduring such a troublesome environment.
Yeah, and the reason they were mentally strong is because they developed a way to be connected with one another. That was the key. They're supportive of one another.
Right.
A very difficult thing to figure out under those circumstances, but they did. They figured out an incredible way of communicating with one another and planning how they were going to support one another. I mean, that made a whole lot of difference.
Absolutely. I think that is something we lack in society now due to like social media and things. A lot of us feel alone. So having that connection with others, you know, that helps with, hey, you're not alone. These individuals did the exact same thing. They experienced the same thing. They are dealing with it just like you are, as well as holding people accountable. And I noticed that that's something that Boulder Crest does. It's not a catch and release program. They actually follow up with them to hold the individuals that go through their foundation accountable to doing what they said that they were going to do.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. And that's a way of being supported. Holding people accountable is a way of supporting them. It's not being mean to them.
Exactly.
You know, it's being the best kind of friend. So figuring out a way to do that and communicate that is crucial.
In one of your videos, you discussed something called self-disclosure. And I believe at Struggle Well or Boulder Crest, you guys do that through MOS. My Old Story, I believe it's called. Can you
Right.
speak to why that is beneficial?
Yeah, part of My Old Story, we use MOS because, of course, that has a military connotation. So, yeah, My Old Story is often how you've related to people in the past and how you feel people have treated you and what kind of patterns you've developed in your relationships with other people and your relationship with yourself as a result of all that. And that old story gets repeated again and again, kind of in your mind in the way you carry yourself throughout your life. And you have to confront that and see that that doesn't have to be the only way, that there's a new way of doing things, a different way of doing things. And you don't need to keep repeating this past so that you set up relationships with people to come out the same way over and over again, some negative way.
Right.
So we help people confront that and see that and have some insight into that part of their way of relating to other people and their way of seeing themselves, so they can start to change that. So that process includes a good deal of discussion and disclosure. People need to talk that through and open up about what's happened in the past, what's happened in relation to other people. And often that's very painful stuff to open up. It could have to do with your parents. It could have to do with people you've lost. It could have to do with ways you've mistreated people or regrets you have. It could have to do with ways that people have abused you, all kinds of things. So that's the tough part of disclosure, is getting to those vulnerabilities.
Awesome. Well, with that, we'll wrap it up for now. I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate and respect the work that you're doing, and I'm glad that you're trying to help your comrades and make a lot of this available to people. So it's good
Awesome.
work.
Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Welcome.
Bye.
Bye.
And with that, we're going to wrap things up with Dr. Tedeschi. And hopefully you guys enjoyed it. It was a little bit shorter than I anticipated. Lesson learned there on my end. We'll do better. So with that, look at the show notes. I've referenced a few other interviews with Dr. Tedeschi, and they dive into a few of the topics that I was looking to get into that I didn't. So hope you guys enjoy that. Thanks.